Please welcome the Chief of Knowledge and Innovation Branch at UN Habitat, all the way from Kenya. Let's welcome Dr. Edlam Yemeru.
Good morning. I hope energy levels are still reasonable. You had a coffee not long ago, so I hope we're together. Anyway, I'm joining you from the United Nations Human Settlements Program based in Nairobi, Kenya. This is where our headquarters are located. And I would say that this is the part of the United Nations that is most relevant for the conversation that's happening today, which is about communities. And in that respect, UN Habitat actually stands for the United Nations Human Settlements Program. So it's about settlements, it's about communities, it's about spaces, it's about placemaking, but at the center of our name actually is the notion of being human-focused and people-centered. And that's pretty much what my talk today will be focusing on, which is the human scale, cities for people, and I think reminding ourselves why humanity or Homo sapiens decided to live in cities. We decided to live in cities for very specific and clear reasons. And I think if we remind ourselves of those reasons, some of which I'll be doing today, then we can truly think about human-scaled or human-scale cities, human-scale communities that work for us no matter where we're from and no matter where we live. So yeah, as mentioned, I lead the knowledge and innovation part of UN Habitat, where we do a lot of the policy research, analytics, data, statistics, also looking at innovation and smart city development. So what do we mean when we talk about human scale communities? It is not a new notion. It's not a new concept. It's been around for a while, and it's been espoused by several world thought leaders and practitioners. One of the earliest ones was actually Jane Jacobs, who may be well known to many of you here, who was a very well-recognized urbanist that actually promoted the notion of human scale and focusing on people as a priority in the way that we design our cities and the way that we plan and manage our cities. And I want to share a quote from her, which says that there is no logic that can be superimposed on the city. People make it, and it is to them and not buildings that we must fit our plans. And so as we gather here today, as you gather here today as business leaders in the real estate context, this is some of the message that is important to remind ourselves about. What is it for? Who is it for? How does it actually work for people in the context of cities? Another quotation I'd like to share with you is from, again, the world-famous architect Jan Gehl of Denmark, who, in his own words, said, the most important aspect is the people scale. The city at the eye level and at a 5 km/h pace. And this knowledge, Gehl says, has been lost by architects and planners. And so how much of that do we build into our thinking, into our projects, into our investments? These are some of the questions that I'd like us to think about today. And so looking back at the sort of progression of cities and communities globally before the 20th century, and dating all the way back to some of the most ancient cities that human beings constructed and created, they were very much about the human scale. And these are images of cities that are still in existence today, but were built in the 19th century and before the 1960s. And what you can see is clear remnants of how they were indeed human scale. The one in blue is from Chefchaouen in Morocco. The second one is Osaka. The third one is from France. And the last one is Quito, Ecuador. And what you can see in this context is that pathways are built for people to walk, not necessarily for cars. more space is dedicated to public squares for the purpose of human interaction and recreation, rather than for parking vehicles. It's not to say that we should not design our cities for vehicles, but it's really a question of balancing the focus that we place on the more functional approach to designing cities versus designing cities thinking about how human beings interact with their surroundings, how they're able to experience their surroundings, and how people are able to connect to the spaces and to the locations in which they live in cities. And so some of our most ancient cities and cities built before the 1960s, 1950s were indeed human scale. They placed people at the center. They were built for cities. That was the priority. And then we think about the advent of the automobile and the sort of transitions that we see in architecture, especially through the 1960s modernism. And with the automobile in particular, we started to shift further and further away from the notion of human scale. The kind of infrastructure we built into our cities, the kind of spatial layout of our cities began to transition because we could move further quicker. We could live in cities that were not necessarily human scale, were rather auto scale, if I can frame it in that way. And we saw the advent of a more rationalist approach to planning and designing cities. And so the image on the left is a rationalist model of city construction that was typical and beginning to emerge in the 1960s and thereafter. The one on the right is Brasilia in Brazil, which is in a way representing the epitome of modernist, non-human scale planning and design of cities. And so with the advent of the automobile and our ability to live across wider spaces in cities, we see a transition away from human scale planning and thinking. Just reflecting on what lies ahead for our cities, where we are today and what we can anticipate looking ahead. Can we imagine sort of a reversal back to the idea of human scale and people-centered planning and design of cities? Or will we continue to see this ultra sort of modernist, auto-focused, sprawling design of cities and urban areas? And in this respect, I want to bring it back to the United Nations, and I want to bring it back to the conversation that's happening at the global scale in the context of the United Nations, where world leaders come together to define a vision for any particular development agenda, and in this case, cities. So what is the world vision that world governments, your governments, our governments agreed to in 2015? That takes me to the Sustainable Development Goals, and specifically within the Sustainable Development Goals, it may or may not be well known that we have Sustainable Development Goal 11, which indeed is about reestablishing and reviving a focus on human scale cities. So SDG 11 focuses on making cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. And I want to dive into 3 components of this global commitment, which actually is about making sure that our cities are human scale and human centered. In the context of the Sustainable Development Goal 11 and the global commitment of world governments, we can imagine human scale at 3 levels. The first is the city scale. And in this respect, world governments have committed to ensuring that we have affordable and sustainable transport systems. This is about making sure that for people that are living in cities, they can connect, they can access, they can be a part of the wider existence of a city. And transport, public transport in particular, is fundamental for this. So human scale is not only about, in my opinion, the 5-kilometer range or the walkable range. Yes, that's a priority, but in the cities of the world today, it's also important to think about transport systems that allow us or make the city accessible to anyone at any particular point in time. So there is actually a global commitment to ensure that we have affordable, sustainable transport systems in our cities. So that's the city scale. That's a commitment to ensure that the city as a whole is indeed accessible to people and to communities. The next scale, which is really looking at the neighborhood scale, bringing it closer to where people live, to where people work, to where people spend their time. This is another level of commitment to making sure that our cities are human scale. And in this respect, again, in the context of the Sustainable Development Goal 11, there is one element which is fundamental for making sure that our neighborhoods are human scale: public spaces. This is a crucial way in which people experience a city, connect to a city, connect to a place. And in this respect, we do have a global commitment to provide access to safe and inclusive green and public spaces. I'll be telling you a little bit about where we are with these commitments and how much progress we've made, which I think can be quite revealing as well. So thinking about the city scale at the highest level in terms of connectivity and access, public transport is fundamental for that. At the neighborhood scale, public space is a key entry point to making sure that our cities are human scale and accessible. And finally, thinking about the home and housing, which is where our existence starts, all of us. Your day starts at your house and your day ends at your house. So fundamentally, your home and your house is a big part of your existence for all of us. And so what does it mean to make sure that at that level of existence, our cities are human scale? And this is a much, much wider conversation. There is a global commitment to ensure that both the public sector and other actors commit to providing safe and affordable housing globally. And we have very ambitious targets. But any of us sat here today would agree that in each of your cities where you live, there is a housing crisis, regardless of where you come from, regardless of where you live. And so we've set ambitious targets, but we may not be necessarily making progress towards that. So housing is at the most lowest and fundamental level, a key component of making sure that our cities are human scale. That is a starting point. Now, just delving a little bit further into where we are with respect to these three levels of thinking about human scale communities and human scale cities, I'll start with the home level. And I was looking at housing. The global picture doesn't look very good. We haven't talked a lot about informality and informal settlements since our conversation started yesterday at this forum. But in today's world, 1.1 billion people, including some in this region, live in slums and informal settlements. 1.1 billion. And in total, we have 2.8 million people that face different forms of housing inadequacy across the globe. So it may be informality and slums in certain parts of the world. In other parts of the world, it's homelessness. We have 320 million people today that are homeless. And we estimate actually that the numbers might be higher than that. So in this respect, how can we think about human scale communities when actually at the most basic level of housing and the home, these are the realities that up to 3 billion people face today? So what you see on screen is trends in terms of the change in informality and slums globally. And what's interesting is that while the proportion of people in cities living in slums is going down, the absolute number is increasing. And so in reality, we're not really moving the needle. And as I said, 1.1 billion people. When you look at the figures for the world, you can see how the absolute number continues to rise. That's the yellow line. Yes, the proportion is on the downward slide, but the absolute numbers are increasing. When you look at Eastern and Southern Asia, you do see an overall decline, but still, I mean, the absolute numbers are significant. Central Asia is where you see the absolute number of slum populations on the rise. So why am I sharing this? I'm sharing this and the figures on the next slide to show that when we think human scale, we cannot think human scale without addressing the global housing crisis and the fact that 3 billion people today face housing inadequacy. And again, why is this relevant for this forum? Because you are the business leaders that are working on real estate and the delivery of housing. And I think the call to you really today is to think about how can we make a business case for affordable housing? Because the demand is huge across continents, across regions, across countries. And so I think it's about matching the demand for affordable housing with some of the priorities for you as business leaders. More figures, as I said, 2.8 billion affected by housing inadequacy, 1.1 billion in slums and informal settlements. In the last 20 years, almost 170 million people have become slum dwellers. So this is the reality at the global level. Close to 320 million people experiencing homelessness across regions. This is not about the global south. It's a global conversation. So that's looking at the notion of human scale at the level of city, but at the level of homes. Just wanting to share with you that at UN Habitat, we actually do quite a bit of work in terms of addressing human scale communities vis-a-vis housing. We do some work in Mozambique, which, as some of you might know, Mozambique in Africa is very prone to disaster risk on a recurring basis. So we're working with the government to build hurricane adaptive homes because many of the settlements and communities in Mozambique are hit by hurricanes on quite a regular basis, recurring basis. Many of you might have heard in the news that Beirut experienced a massive explosion in 2020. And in this respect, we're working with the government again to address questions of displacement. And of course, we're also looking at restoration of culture and cultural assets in the context of Beirut as UN Habitat. Now, moving on to the neighborhood level, as I said earlier, and how we experience our city at the neighborhood scale, I want to talk about public space, as I said earlier, because this is fundamental in terms of how we experience our neighborhood. And in this respect, if you look at SDG 11, as I said, there is a commitment to ensure that public space is accessible in our cities, but this is what the reality looks like. The global average, only about 45% of people living in cities today have convenient access to open public space. So then can we say that our cities and communities are truly human scale? What is happening here? Because public space, as many of us know, is an absolutely essential ingredient of how we experience our cities, how we live in our cities, how we connect to our cities, and for placemaking more broadly. And you can see, for example, Eastern and Southeastern Asia, 26% have access to open public space. Central and Southern Asia, 35%. So I think this is quite telling in terms of how we're designing and planning our cities and for what purpose and for what end. So again, a little bit about our work at UN Habitat. We're also doing work on public space. And here, this is work that we did in Pristina with Minecraft around public space and public parks, the design of public parks, and working with communities to actually design solutions for public spaces. We're doing similar work in Somaliland, Berbera, in Somaliland, in the African continent, where we are working with partners around rehabilitating and creating accessible, usable public spaces along the beachfront of Berbera. Moving on to the city scale. So I've talked about the home scale, the neighborhood scale, and the third level is the city scale when we think about human scale cities. And here, as I said, one aspect, one global commitment is around public transport. And again, across your cities, how is public transport in your city today? Hands up if it's great. Okay, I'd like you to look around the room. I think I just saw 4 or 5. Just, okay. Hands up if it's not that great and you wish there were better public transport. Okay, so it's clear. I don't need to present any numbers. And so I had a conversation this morning with someone who's from Hong Kong who said to me, I thought public transport and public transit was just fundamental to a city's existence, and that I thought that it existed elsewhere. I said, far from it. And this is regardless of levels of development or income status for countries. So what does the status of public transport look like globally today? Only about half of the people that live in our cities and our communities today have access to public transport. And you can see how it's much lower in some parts of the world. Eastern and Southern Asia, 40%. Some regions are higher, but in general, you can see that it's in the 40 to 30 range. So 50 to 60% of urban residents today have no access to public transport. And therefore, that immediately is indicative of whether our cities are really human scale, accessible, how are people experiencing cities. And there's a wide variation between those that are living in highly car-oriented, auto-oriented cities versus those that are having to rely walking and informal means of transport. So this is what the global picture looks like. And in a study that we did around people's perceived needs of walking and cycling in Africa, for example, the results are quite telling in terms of people's perceptions around walking, around cycling, and how safe they feel, or the risks that they experience in terms of walking and cycling, and the importance they place on these means of moving around cities. Again, back to UN Habitat's work, we're working with the city of Cairo, Egypt, to develop bike networks as a means of promoting more accessible cities and really looking at human scale mobility. And I think that's the main message here, human scale mobility. What does that really look like in our cities? We're working in cities in Kenya and Afghanistan, looking at not so high cost interventions and measures that can really make our cities a lot better in terms of how we move, safety. In this context, for example, we are working on a simple measure of making pathways for crossing more colorful, more people-friendly, and more sort of visible. Now, conscious of time, because I run out of my time by 3 minutes actually, what is the message from UN Habitat? And I think what is the takeaway from my intervention today, which I believe has direct relevance for you as business leaders, for you as, investors, and in your role in shaping the form and spatial layout of our cities, the way in which people experience the communities that you're building, and ultimately the future of our cities. I should have said in the beginning, perhaps it's already a well-known fact, that we are in an urban era. We once quoted a notion at UN Habitat called Homo urbanus, because we're not going back, we're going to live in cities and urban areas. So the notion of communities is absolutely fundamental to our existence and how we will continue to experience development more broadly. So our message is threefold, 3 C's, cliche, but they are 3 C's. First is compact development. And again, that's about proximity and what that means for human beings experiencing the city. Compact versus sprawling cities. I think that's a major message. How are our investments in properties and infrastructure, etc., anchored in enabling compact development? How many of you have been in a city that's compact, well-connected, not sprawling, and you felt, oh, wow, this is nice. I can go to the shop. I can access, whatever service I need. I can walk here and there. I'm right in the middle of everything. That's really the notion of compact development. The other piece is cohesive. And cohesive is about integrated rather than fragmented communities. We know that in many of our cities today, regardless of where you're from, fragmentation, inequality the gaps are getting wider. How many of you feel that in your city, you see a deepening of fragmentation on income levels? It could be, racial dynamics, ethnicity, all sorts of factors. How many of you feel that your cities are less integrated as they continue to grow and as they continue to develop? And you as business leaders have a role to play in this in terms of the outcomes of your investment and the properties that you're continuing to build and promote. And finally, connected. And this goes back to public transport. How connected are people to what they need to access in a city? I want to go back to the fundamentals of why people decided to live in cities. People decided to live in cities because they wanted to be connected. They wanted to be a part of a larger system. They wanted to benefit from agglomeration, being together, and being able to share opportunities, being able to share risks, shoulder risks together. So these are the advantages why we decided to live in cities. Otherwise, we would have stayed in rural areas and, each to each his own in a farm. We wanted security in cities. So these are the fundamentals. And so being connected means being able to access all these benefits in a city. If you're living in a community that's cut off, in a community that has to pay a lot to be able to access services, and you're disconnected, then that is not human scale development in the context of a city. So these are the three messages: compact, connected, cohesive development of communities and cities. Finally, few words on how you can partner with us, and this is why I'm here, is really to look at forms of partnership and put out there some of the work that we have as well. We have really a lot of guidelines and sort of tools for city leaders, for decision makers on what all of this means: compact, cohesive, and connected urban development. For example, we have international guidelines on urban and territorial planning, and I'm hoping that some of this messaging, some of these tools can actually inform your investments, your decisions, your partnerships, and how you look at developing cities. Finally, also, I want to introduce to you that at UN Habitat, we're just starting a global campaign on housing matters, going back to really considering the housing crisis that we face today globally. This is an advocacy campaign, and it's for all of us. It's not just a UN sort of campaign for the public sector, but we're really looking at the private sector joining this global campaign. I'm happy to share more information on this as well. And in this campaign, we're going to look at many of the issues that have been discussed today: climate action, livability, crisis as a major factor as well. So please join Housing Matters as a global campaign. Would love to work with, many of you here in this room as developers, as investors in this space. And then I have to say something about data. How many of you have hit a wall when you've been looking for global figures on housing affordability, for example, housing prices, and any other data on housing? You may have it for your city, for your country, for your community. You want to go regional or global, you hit a wall. I hit a wall every day because this is my work at UN Habitat. So we really want to scale up our work on housing indicators and data. Would love to partner with some of you here in the room. We've been doing this since 1988, but we recognize that unless we do it together, we're not going to move the needle. I've had some conversations with some of you, so be happy to talk to you about that as well. Housing data and being able to monitor what's happening in the housing sector better together. So really looking at that as well. A few final slides. Join the UN Global Compact. You'll be interested to know that there are already 58 real estate companies from Asia Pacific participating in the UN Global Compact. So this is a commitment for the private sector to partner with the UN and kind of bridge what I would say is the gap between the public sector and the private sector coming around common goals around sustainability, sustainable communities for the future. So check out the UN Global Compact. I don't know if some of you are part of it. As I said, 58 real estate companies are a part of it from this region. This is my final slide. This is an invitation. In November 2024, we will have the World Urban Forum. This is the biggest party on anything urban. Normally, we have 15 to 20,000 people. Anyone that's working on urban really turns up at this forum. The next one is in Cairo, and we'll be holding the World Urban Forum in November 2024. So this is an open invitation. Consider it, think about it. Let's see what we can do together. It's really a major global platform where we can join hands in putting forward the message around human scale communities and your role in promoting that. Thank you very much. And I'm sorry I've taken so much more time than allocated. Thank you.